Welcome, ghouls. This is our 15th episode of the Shrouded in Darkness podcast, and I'm your true crime-obsessed host, Marlena. I haven't mentioned our disclosure lately, so let's do a quick reminder. The stories I share contain material that I have personally researched, and some of that may very well be disturbing, like in today's case. At Shrouded in Darkness, our goal is to always educate, discuss, and bring fresh light to cases. I want to open up discussions, and I want people's stories to be heard. So without further ado, let's dive into today's show. We're talking about the monster who is George Brinkman. I usually start with some background information, but we know very little about George Brinkman and his early life, which this kind of seems to be an ongoing theme for some serial killers. We do know he was born January 28th in 1972. He didn't have a fantastic upbringing. Reports show he was actually abused as a child and then homeless as an adult. He also spent time in prison for nonviolent crimes like disorderly conduct. His stepfather would later describe George as a handy and shy man, someone that's good with children, someone that had a troubled life, but not someone you would expect to have violent tendencies. A lot actually happened leading up to the nightmare part of the story. In 2013, George was dumped by his girlfriend, Stacy John. This was after a 10-year relationship. That same year, he lost his mother to cancer. And 2 years later, his brother committed suicide. Then comes 2017, which should be about 2 years after his brother passed away. This is the year everything would drastically change. Not just for George Brinkman and his family, but also for the families of his unsuspecting victims. It was June 10th, 2017. George, at 45 years old, entered the North Royalton, Ohio home of Suzanne Taylor. They would later be joined by her two daughters, Taylor and Kylie. I have such few details on this day, but we do know there was some kind of argument that resulted in George binding the ladies' wrists and ankles and then killing them, one by one. Suzanne was murdered with a knife, Taylor smothered with a pillow, and Kylie strangled with a phone cord. After his violent act, he carried their lifeless bodies to one of their beds and covered them with a blanket. To me, this actually shows some remorse. Not really sure if that's true, but that's what I've heard is, he's covering the bodies. So then he spends the next several hours cleaning up the crime scene. This wasn't a random act. George knew the Taylor family. He knew them well. He'd been friends with Suzanne since grade school. Her children had practically grown up around George, and he'd completed odd jobs for them off and on through the years. Sadly, this isn't where the story stops. George continues to the home of his next victims in Lake Township, still in Ohio, but about 45 miles away. Rodgel Eugene John II and Roberta Ray John. This was another family that George had worked for. He'd even recently house sat while they were away for vacation. He'd taken care of their beloved pet and had known the family for more than 10 years. He even dated their daughter at one point. I actually mentioned her earlier, Stacy John. Remember? She'd broken things off with George in 2013. So on this tragic day, George Brinkman entered the couple's home, retrieved their own handgun, and forced them into an upstairs bedroom. This is where he shot Rodgel 3 times, and then he struck Roberta in the head and shot her twice. Before fleeing, he stole some cash. It wasn't even much. It was less than $100, maybe $40. A couple days passed before anyone was aware of the monstrosity that had occurred. June 12th. Taylor, remember that was Suzanne's daughter. Her boyfriend grew worried when he hadn't heard from her. He couldn't get in touch with her. So he went to the home and noticed that Suzanne's door was actually closed, which was kind of rare for them. he would eventually find their lifeless bodies. He notified the police and then called George Brinkman, he knowing that he was a close friend of the family. According to the boyfriend, George seemed surprised and saddened by the news. I'm sure that boyfriend was beyond shocked later on when he learned the truth. The same day Suzanne and her family were discovered, the Johns were found by their son. When Roger didn't show up for work, the son went by the house to check on his parents. He was not prepared for the scene that he walked into. But I guess who would be? So let's go back to George. After his murderous actions, he visited a female friend in Brunswick, Ohio. This is one of the people that he would occasionally stay with since he had no home of his own. Detectives were able to use cell phone pings to find where he was. The SWAT team helped bring him in, along with a stun gun. Of course, this was after an 8-hour standoff in the residence. Now, George denies everything at first. He tells some good stories, shows a lot of care for those victims. It's not until several hours later that he finally admits that the police have the right person. That it all started because he and Suzanne got into an argument. Of course, if you look at details in the court records, this didn't just happen. George had purchased the items he used days before anything happened, like the zip ties he used to bandage their arms, their hands, and their wrists. He also bought duct tape. So, bearing that in mind, it kind of seems like this was a premeditated crime. Moving on, there were separate trials for both sets of murders. The Taylor family's trial was in November 2018, and the John family was in October of 2019, almost a year apart. George pleaded guilty in both cases. He was sentenced to death and 47 years in prison. In an interesting turn, on July 21st, 2021, the conviction and death sentence from the first trial, so the Taylor family, it was overturned. Apparently, the judge at the time of that 2018 trial failed to advise the perpetrator of his rights. The defense team claims that he didn't understand that his pleading guilty waived his constitutional rights. Thankfully, though, this doesn't change the outcome of that second trial. George is still guilty of murder, and he will receive the death sentence. And in actuality, it's currently scheduled for this year, 2026, on September 23rd. Now, as you know, we like to mention the victims because those should be the most important part of any case like this. So let's take a look at those 5 people that lost their lives that day. Suzanne Taylor graduated from Valley Forge High School in 1990. She continued to college where she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and political science. At the time of her murder, she was a real estate appraiser. She lived in a Cleveland suburb with her 2 daughters, Taylor and Kylie. Taylor Pfeiffer was 21, enrolled as a junior at Kent State University when she met her untimely death. She was working towards a degree in fashion design and merchandising. Her sister Kylie was 18. She was about to begin her sophomore year at Bowling Green State University. She had a love of theater, studied biology, and hoped to become a forensic scientist. Roger Eugene John II was a 71-year-old university graduate and Vietnam War veteran. After working as a circulation director, he began his own business distributing phone books and publications. His wife, Roberta Ray, was also a university graduate and 64 years of age. She attended both Ohio and Akron universities. Before she retired, she worked in special education as a teacher and administrator. Before we wrap things up on this horrible case, let's go over a few additional facts. It's believed that George had romantic feelings for his first victim, Suzanne. And oddly enough, it's believed her girls looked up to him. Some say he was even a father figure. After all, he'd been around them for many years. And to me, this just makes the crime that much worse. George's defense team argued against the death sentence, stating he had a difficult childhood. I mean, he was homeless. He suffered mental health issues. But in contrast, George asked for no favors. He was for the death sentence. He stated that his victims were good, kind people that didn't deserve to die at his hands. And even though it didn't really help matters, he did apologize to the families. There are no records that I could find showing why George turned on his friends, why he suddenly turned so aggressive and violent. Even after all these people had been good to him. I mean, places to stay, jobs, they gave him opportunity. So in this case, it's almost like there was no real motive, which is bizarre. And I have to say that a case like this leaves an impression. I can't tell you how many times I tried searching for details, hoping to know more. Not for morbid reasons, of course, but for the families. Knowing that they were such good people and that they gave this monster, purpose and places to stay in a community of friends. And then for him to just live in their lives so brutally. I'm really struggling with this one. Not that any murder is ever really understandable, but there's usually something leading up to it. There's some kind of beforehand thing that happens. I could just keep going on, but we need to wrap things up. So tell me, have you heard of George Brinkman's case? I would love to hear your thoughts. And one final note on where the research came from. For this case, we used Wikipedia, Cleveland 19, Heavy.com, and WKYC. I also read through part of the court documents, kind of hoping for clarification, I guess. So anywho, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, you can connect with us on social media like Instagram and WordPress. Just look us up under the Shrouded in Darkness podcast. Don't forget to share your feedback, give us your show ideas, and ask your questions. Catch next week's show where we'll be talking about the Moonlight Murders. Until next time, ghouls.